The weather's closing in on us here. It's been snowing a little bit. It's been cold. It's that end of season push. And everybody's doing a really good job.
There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a mining camp when something genuinely unexpected has been found. It is not the silence of failure or exhaustion, though gold mining in the Yukon produces plenty of both. It is something different, a held breath, a collective pause while the brain tries to process information that does not fit any previous frame of reference. The men and women who work those remote northern claims have seen enough disappointment over enough seasons to have built strong defenses against excitement. They have watched promising ground turn barren and watched expensive equipment break down at the worst possible moment and watched weather systems roll in from the north and shut down operations that were just beginning to produce. Skepticism is the professional default in the Klondike. And that is precisely why the moment that Parker Schnabel's crew reached the bottom of a long-abandoned vertical shaft in a section of ground that most experienced miners had written off entirely, and found what was waiting for them there in the darkness, carried the weight that it did. The silence that followed was not the silence of doubt. It was the silence of people who had just seen something they were not sure they were allowed to believe yet. Parker Schnabel has been a fixture of Gold Rush on Discovery Channel since he was a teenager, joining the show in its early seasons and growing up in front of its cameras in a way that is unusual even by the standards of reality television. He came to the Klondike with an inheritance that was not financial. His grandfather John Schnabel was one of the most respected gold miners in Alaska, a man whose big nugget mine near Haines had been operating for generations and whose approach to the work combined old-fashioned determination with a willingness to learn from every season's results. Parker absorbed that approach from early childhood, spending time in the shop and around the equipment in the way that children who grow up around working operations absorb knowledge before they can fully articulate it. By the time he took over his grandfather's mining operation at 19, he was not a novice playing at an adult enterprise. He was a young man with a genuinely formed philosophy about how to find gold and what it cost to reach it. What has distinguished Parker's career on the show from many of his fellow miners is a combination of ambition and adaptability that has consistently pushed him toward ground that others considered too difficult or too uncertain. While miners like Tony Beets, the Dutch-born veteran whose family operation on the Klondike River has been running for decades, represent a tradition of accumulated experience and hard-won knowledge about specific ground, Parker has always been willing to bring new approaches to old problems. His move to the Yukon from Alaska, his willingness to operate on claims that required significant investment before they would produce, and his consistent ability to identify undervalued ground have been themes that run through his story across multiple seasons. The discovery that unfolded at what the crew called the Widow's Cut was the most dramatic expression of that instinct in his career to date. The ground at the Widow's Cut had a reputation that preceded any particular season's decision-making. In the Klondike, stories about specific pieces of ground travel through the mining community the way stories travel through any close-knit occupational culture, through conversations at equipment suppliers, through exchanges between crews who share access roads, through the accumulated folklore of the gold fields that stretches back to the original rush of 1896 and 1897. The Widow's Cut had failed enough operations and damaged enough equipment to have earned a kind of informal warning status. The geological challenges were real and well documented. The ground in that section of the Yukon sits over deep permafrost, ground that has been frozen continuously for thousands of years and that behaves like something between rock and saturated earth, stable when left undisturbed but capable of sudden catastrophic failure when the frozen matrix is disrupted by excavation. Working in permafrost requires a specific kind of patience and a specific kind of engineering, and the margin for error is narrow in ways that surface mining in less extreme conditions does not replicate. The vertical shaft that LiDAR mapping revealed beneath the overgrown surface of the Widow's Cut was a remnant of earlier mining activity, a feature of the original Klondike Rush era, when the techniques available to prospectors required vertical access to the gold-bearing gravels that lay beneath thick overburden. Hydraulic and dredge mining eventually replaced much of this shaft-based work, but the shafts themselves remained, slowly filling with debris and obscured by a century of vegetation growth and frost heaving. Finding a pre-existing vertical access point changes the economics of mining a difficult section of ground substantially. Creating a new decline or access ramp through solid permafrost is expensive, time-consuming, and carries significant ground stability risk. Working with an existing shaft, stabilizing and reinforcing what is already there rather than carving new passage, represents a fundamentally different engineering problem, though not necessarily an easier one. LiDAR technology, which Parker's team deployed in drone-mounted configuration to map the Widow's Cut before committing to any excavation, works by firing rapid pulses of laser light at the ground surface and measuring the return times to construct precise three-dimensional models of the terrain. Its particular value in heavily vegetated environments like the Yukon is its ability to penetrate through forest canopy and surface vegetation to reveal the actual shape of the ground beneath, including human-made features like collapsed shafts, old water channels, and historic surface workings that would be invisible to conventional aerial photography. The technology has transformed exploration and preliminary assessment work across the mining industry, and its application in the Klondike has accelerated significantly as the equipment has become more accessible to operations that are large enough to justify the expense but not necessarily at the scale of major corporate mining. Parker's decision to use it at the Widow's Cut was consistent with his broader approach to applying available technology rather than relying entirely on intuition and experience. When the LiDAR data was processed and the team examined the resulting terrain model, the collapsed shaft appeared as a precisely linear anomaly in a landscape of otherwise organic surface variation. The straight lines of human construction do not occur in natural terrain, and their presence in LiDAR data is reliably diagnostic. The shaft extended more than 40 meters into the earth, a depth that would have represented significant investment and significant geological knowledge on the part of the original miners who sank it. The fact that they chose that location suggested that they had identified mineralization that warranted the effort. Historic mining locations in the Klondike frequently cluster around gold-bearing structures that the original prospectors identified empirically, through placer sampling and surface signs, without the formal geological mapping tools available today. Finding that an old shaft aligned with a significant quartz vein structure was confirmation, not coincidence. The work of stabilizing and accessing the shaft took weeks that tested the crew's patience and the structural engineering knowledge of the team's experienced operators. Reinforcing a collapse-prone underground structure in permafrost conditions requires careful sequencing. The steel supports must be installed progressively as access is gained, with constant attention to ground behavior and water intrusion, both of which can change rapidly as the thermal state of the surrounding material responds to the heat generated by equipment and human presence. Permafrost thaw, once initiated, can be extremely difficult to control, and the water released by thawing ice-rich ground can flood a working area before pumping equipment can respond adequately. The tension that runs through this phase of any underground Klondike mining operation is genuine and not manufactured for camera effect. The physical hazards are real, documented in the occupational safety literature for underground cold region mining, and they require constant vigilance from everyone working in or near the shaft. What the crew found when they finally reached the base of the reinforced shaft was the kind of geological feature that miners in any era would recognize immediately as extraordinary. A quartz vein carrying visible gold is not common, and a large, continuous quartz vein carrying high concentrations of coarse gold in a section of the Klondike that had not been worked in over a century represented a discovery outside the normal range of expectations for any single season's operations. Quartz-hosted gold occurs in the Klondike as lode gold. The primary source from which the placer gold that originally drew prospectors to the region was derived through millions of years of erosion and redeposition. Finding significant lode mineralization in a working placer operation is unusual enough that most active Klondike miners encounter it rarely or not at all across their careers. The geologist working with Parker's crew assessed the vein's extent based on its visible dimensions, its orientation relative to the surrounding geology, and the grade of gold it was carrying, and arrived at an estimate that stopped the conversation in its tracks. The initial extraction that followed, working intensively for approximately 72 hours without significant interruption, driving the operation hard while the access was confirmed safe and the ground remained stable, produced a cleanup that represented one of the single largest short-term recoveries in the show's documented history. More than 4,000 ounces of gold, valued at well over $10 million at prevailing gold prices, came out of that first push into the vein structure. This was not a record achieved through careful incremental accumulation over a full season. It was the result of a concentrated engagement with exceptionally rich ground over a period measured in days. The financial significance of that single cleanup, covering operating costs, equipment expenses, and crew wages for an entire season in one weekend, was not lost on anyone in the camp. Gold prices in 2024 and into 2025 had been moving through a period of sustained elevation, with spot prices reaching and at times exceeding $2,400 per troy ounce as inflation concerns, geopolitical uncertainty, and sustained central bank purchasing drove demand. At those prices, the arithmetic of the vein extension estimate produced numbers that were genuinely difficult to hold in mind. A 2-kilometer continuous run of vein mineralization at the grade the initial extraction had revealed, fully extracted, represented gold worth in the range of $75 million. That figure carried all the qualifications that any geological estimate carries: assumptions about continuity, grade consistency, extractability, and the technical challenges of accessing the full extent of the structure. But it was grounded in real measurements from real material that had already been demonstrated to be exactly as rich as the estimate required. The broader context of Parker's career at this point matters for understanding why the discovery carried the weight it did beyond simple financial value. He had been pursuing the 7,000-ounce season as a benchmark for years, a target that his crews had approached and occasionally reached, but that represented the upper range of what a single Klondike operation could achieve through conventional means. The discovery at the Widow's Cut changed the parameters of what was achievable entirely, because it introduced a source of gold that was not dependent on the volume of dirt processed but on the concentration of a primary lode deposit. Placer mining economics are fundamentally about throughput, moving enough material through the wash plant to accumulate gold from low-grade distributed deposits. Lode mining economics are fundamentally different, dependent on the grade and accessibility of a concentrated vein structure. The Widow's Cut was operating on lode mining economics in a placer mining operation, and the results reflected that difference. The response from the broader Klondike mining community to news of the discovery was the kind of complicated mixture that major finds always generate in tight-knit competitive environments. Admiration competed with skepticism. Genuine interest in the geological implications competed with calculations about claim values in the surrounding area. Tony Beats, whose decades of experience in the Klondike give his assessments particular weight, had been a recurring presence in Parker's story across multiple seasons, sometimes as a genuine source of wisdom and equipment, sometimes as a competitor whose interests did not align with Parker's. The dynamics of that relationship, and of Parker's relationships with other operators in the region, became more complex in the wake of a discovery that substantially altered the perceived value of the ground Parker controlled. The legal and logistical challenges that accompany any major discovery in a jurisdiction where mineral rights, surface rights, and indigenous land claims intersect in complicated ways are not simply dramatic background noise. They are real and consequential. The Yukon Territory operates under a mineral rights system administered through Yukon Energy, Mines and Resources, and claim staking, transfer, and protection require compliance with regulatory requirements that are detailed and strictly enforced. Challenges to claim validity, whether through competing historical claims, boundary disputes, or questions about the terms of claim acquisition, are a documented feature of major discovery situations in the Klondike, and Parker's team had to be prepared for exactly that kind of challenge arriving once the scale of the find became known. The crew dynamics that the discovery disrupted were in some ways the most human dimension of a story that also involved geological science and financial calculation. Mining crews in the Klondike operate under conditions of physical hardship and professional pressure that create close bonds between team members over the course of a season, bonds that are also susceptible to fracture when the stakes change suddenly and dramatically. Bonus structures, credit for the find, recognition in the show's narrative, and the simple psychological disruption of being in proximity to a very large amount of money while doing physically demanding and potentially dangerous work, all of these create pressures that good leadership must manage continuously. Parker's development as a leader across his years on the show had been visible and documented, but the Widow's Cut represented a test at a level of magnitude he had not previously encountered. What the discovery ultimately represented, beyond the specific numbers and the specific geological conditions, was the realization of the possibility that animates every person who has ever worked a gold claim in the Klondike, that beneath the frozen ground, under the overburden and the permafrost and the century of accumulated debris, there is still gold waiting that no one has touched. The original rush of 1896 was built on exactly that possibility, and the operations that have continued in the Klondike in the years since have been sustained by the combination of improved technology, persistent ambition, and the documented fact that the region's gold endowment is large enough that significant discoveries remain possible. Parker Schnabel, who grew up hearing about that possibility from a grandfather who had spent his life chasing it, found at the widow's cut the most dramatic confirmation of it that his career had yet produced. The question of what comes next, how much of the vein can be extracted, how the legal and logistical challenges resolve, and whether a young miner who became famous for his ambition can manage the specific pressures that extraordinary success creates, is a question that the Klondike does not answer quickly or easily. It never has.